Before we begin tonight's slow story, I invite you to pause, to let your body soften, to let your breath deepen, and to allow the world around you to quiet down just a little. You've done enough today. Now it's time to rest, to unwind from the noise, to float gently into a slower rhythm. Take a deep breath in and let it go. Notice how your shoulders ease just a bit, how your fingers grow still, how the muscles behind your eyes soften with every blink. You're safe here, you're welcome here, and you don't have to do anything but listen. If you enjoy these gentle bedtime stories, made to help you fall asleep or simply slow down, feel free to subscribe to Fusion Ha. There's a whole playlist of relaxing stories on the channel waiting for you, all told in the same calm, cozy way. No pressure, just a quiet invitation for stillness, for comfort, for sleep. Now, let the sound of my voice fade into the background. Let each word arrive like a soft breath on your skin. Let your thoughts drift like leaves floating on water. You don't need to stay awake for the whole story. You're not here to learn or remember. You're here to let go. Let go of the clock. Let go of the lists. Let go of the weight you've been carrying all day. This is your time now. A moment made just for you. To slow down, to breathe, to drift. And as you settle in, let your mind open gently, like a door creaking open in a quiet house. Let the rest of the world fall away. You're not in a rush. You're not behind. You're exactly where you need to be. Your story is about to begin. But first, just rest here with me in this stillness. Let the hush of evening wrap around you. Let the gentle pace of the story carry you. And when you're ready, we'll begin. The year was 1692. The place, a small Puritan settlement tucked into the forests of colonial Massachusetts. A village of winding dirt paths, wooden houses weathered by long winters, and steeples that reached toward gray skies. Salem Village, they called it then. Quiet, devout, and watchful. Life moved slowly here. The fields were tilled by hand. Children learned to read by candlelight. Meals were cooked over hearths that never cooled, and Sundays stretched long beneath sermons that rang with fire and scripture. The forest that bordered the village was deep and untamed. Beyond its edge, the known world gave way to shadows and wind. The Puritans feared that forest. They saw in it a wilderness, not just of trees and thorns, but of temptations, of devils, of dangers that couldn't be named. It was into this world, quiet, rigid, and brimming with tension, that a strange series of whispers began, not loud at first, not all at once, but like a chill moving beneath a door, or the way one candle flickers before the rest. It began in the winter. A biting cold had settled over Salem. The snow lay thick against the churchyard. Wood was scarce, and the harvest had been poor. In the meeting house, townsfolk whispered of hardship, of unease, of signs. And then The girls began to scream. They were young, daughters of respected men: Elizabeth Parris, age 9, Abigail Williams, age 11. It began with tremors, fits. They fell to the floor, twisted their limbs, shouted words that seemed not their own. They spoke of being pinched, of feeling pricked by invisible needles, of shadows in the corners of the room, of specters. No one understood it. The local doctor could not explain it, and in a place where the spiritual and the physical were never separate, the answer was found not in medicine, but in witchcraft. A word that carried weight, a word that pulled silence from the room, a word that didn't ask for proof, only belief. The girls named names. First, a slave woman named Tituba, brought from the West Indies, servant in the Paris household. Then Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a woman seldom seen, at church. All three women were outsiders, marginal, imperfect, already watched with suspicion. And so, when the accusations came, there was little room for defense. They were arrested, brought before the magistrates, examined, questioned, and in a cold room with wooden walls, fear found its footing. The girls wept, convulsed, screamed aloud in court. They said they saw spirits. They said they were tormented, and soon others joined them. More girls, older women, even grown men. They claimed to see the devil's book, to witness spectral hands, to feel breath on their skin, though no one was near. And the judges, godly men, respected and learned, believed. They believed because they had to, because to doubt the presence of witches was to risk being one of them. The Puritan world held little space for uncertainty. Tituba, under duress, confessed. She said she had seen the devil. She said there were others. She said a great black man had come to her and bid her serve him. Her confession wasn't protection. It was fuel, because if she was telling the truth, the village was under siege. And if she was lying, well, that too was the devil's work. There was no path out. As winter gave way to spring, the accusations multiplied. Names were spoken in whispers. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Old grudges rose from the soil. Even the most devout were not safe. Martha Corey, a churchgoer, a woman of standing, was accused. So was Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, known for kindness and prayer. The community held its breath. If they could be witches, then anyone could. And so the panic deepened. The trials began in earnest in the spring. A new court was formed, the court of Oyer and Terminer, assembled in Salem town. Spectral evidence was allowed, testimony of dreams and visions, invisible wounds, and unseen torment. And the judges listened and believed, because in this world, the spiritual was as real as the physical. The invisible was present in every room, and the devil was not just a metaphor. He was an actor, walking among them. In June, Bridget Bishop was the first to be tried and executed. She had been accused before, years earlier. She was known to be outspoken, unconventional. She wore bright clothes. She was different, and so, despite her pleas, she was hanged on Gallows Hill. Her death marked the beginning of something irreversible. One execution became 5, then more. Men, too, were accused. One, Giles Corey, refused to plead guilty or innocent. He was pressed to death beneath heavy stones. His final words, it is said, were, "More weight." By autumn, the village was exhausted. 19 people hanged, one pressed, hundreds accused, dozens imprisoned, children left without mothers, fields left unharvested, church pews left empty. Even those who once cried, "Witch," began to fall silent. The governor, pressed by doubt and the pleas of ministers, dissolved the court. New trials would not permit spectral evidence. Accusations slowed, then stopped, and slowly Salem returned to itself. But it was not the same. The snow would fall again. The fields would be cleared. The sermons would return. But something had shifted. A trust had broken. A fear had settled, and the red marks on the ledger of time would not be so easily erased. In the years to come, the trials would be remembered not as righteousness, but as tragedy, not as justice, but as warning. And so now, centuries later, we walk those same roads, not with suspicion, but with remembrance. We visit the stone markers. We read the names. We listen to the wind between the trees and wonder how belief can turn so easily to fear. We remember the women, the men, the children left behind, and we remember the silence that followed. Let your breath soften now. You've walked among shadows. You've seen how stories, true and terrifying, can unfold slowly, with quiet, deliberate steps. You've witnessed the hush of the courtroom, the whisper of pine trees beyond the village, the crack of frost on the windows of a meeting house. You may rest now. The story will wait. Sleep, slowly, fully, freely. The snow had melted by the time the last execution was carried out in Salem. Autumn's golden leaves had turned brittle and brown, pressed against the fence posts of small farms and the winding footpaths that led into town. And though no fresh trials had begun, the damage lingered like smoke after a fire. Houses sat quiet, doors stayed shut longer in the morning, children whispered in corners, and even church bells seemed to ring with a more somber note. There had been silence before the trials, when suspicions lived unspoken. Now there was silence after, when words had already done their harm. In the prison cells of Boston and Ipswich, dozens of the accused still waited, not yet tried, not yet freed, cold. Stone walls pressed in around them. Meals were few. Blankets were fewer. Some had spent months in chains, awaiting decisions from courts that no longer convened. Among them were mothers, wives, midwives, men who had questioned too loudly, women who had smiled too brightly, and a few who still could not understand why They'd been taken at all. The world outside had grown cautious, but inside those walls, time held still. Meanwhile, Governor William Phipps had returned to Massachusetts from his campaign in Maine. He had left a colony in spiritual unrest and returned to one unraveling. He read the reports. He listened to the petitions. He heard ministers he respected call for restraint. And so he acted. He disbanded the court of Oyer and Terminer. He forbade the use of spectral evidence in trials. He issued pardons for many still awaiting sentence. The machinery of the trials had been stopped, but the cost of its running was not so easily repaid. In Salem village itself, the community stood fractured. Those who had accused were now shunned. Those who had remained silent carried shame, and those who had lost someone carried that loss alone. Even the ministers struggled. Reverend Samuel Parris, who had fanned the flames from the pulpit and encouraged the early arrests, found his congregation turning against him. He preached repentance, but the church no longer echoed his voice the way it once had. Eventually, he was asked to leave. He did not go quietly. In the years that followed, Salem tried to make sense of itself. There were public fasts, days of official repentance. Some judges and jurors issued statements of regret. Some accusers offered apologies. Some families were granted small sums of restitution by the government. But what amount could undo a hanging? What words could unwrite a name carved in stone? Time passed. Children grew. New ministers were appointed. The village merged into Salem town. And slowly, carefully, the events of 1692 slipped into the realm of history, but not forgotten, never forgotten. Centuries later, we still return to Salem, not just as a place on a map, but as a question in our minds. What makes a neighbor accuse a neighbor? What turns belief into fear? And how do stories, spoken in confidence, or anger, or doubt, take on lives of their own? Historians would later call it mass hysteria, a storm of religious fervor, superstition, and social strain. But the truth, as it often is, was quieter. A series of frightened people, a world where evil was thought to walk in daylight, a court that gave weight to dreams, and a moment where silence felt more dangerous than speech. But there's another truth buried here too, one that grew slowly, like spring grass through cracked earth. The people of Salem remembered. They wrote letters, they spoke in churches, they gathered stones and built markers. They taught their children what had happened, not to glorify, but to warn. The lesson was not about witches. It was about what happens when fear is allowed to speak louder than fairness, when justice is rushed, when pain is mistaken for proof. There's a place now in Salem called the Witch Trials Memorial. It's a quiet courtyard tucked behind a wall shaded by trees. 20 granite benches stretch out, each carved with the name of someone who died. Not just their names, but their voices, final words, carved in stone. Some declare innocence, some offer prayers, some simply say goodbye. You can sit there among the leaves and quiet. You can feel the weight of what happened, not as something distant, but something human. And maybe in that stillness, you'll understand not just what Salem was, but what it continues to be. Let your breath ease now. You've walked further into the story. You've seen the sorrow that outlasted the gallows. You've heard the names whispered beneath oak branches and behind stone walls. There is more still to tell, but for now, let the hush return. Let the candle dim. Let the wind quiet. Let yourself rest beside the names, safe, steady, and held. We will return, but only after sleep. By the winter of 1693, the streets of Salem no longer echoed with accusations. The snow fell as it always did, soft and thick, covering the rooftops. In silence, the meeting house still stood, the hearths still burned, but the voices that once cried, which had grown quiet. In the homes of those who had survived the year before, life was measured differently now. Chores were still done, bread was still baked, the livestock still needed tending, but something unseen had changed. A slowness lingered, a weight, like the hush after a storm that had gone on too long. Children who had watched their mothers, taken in the night, now sat quietly by the window. Men who had once sworn oaths to the court no longer met one another's eyes, and the women of Salem walked carefully now, not from fear of spirits, but from the memory of what their own neighbors were capable of. When fear took hold, even the trees seemed to stand a little farther apart that year. In Boston, the jails began to empty. Many of those accused, still waiting behind bars, were released, though not all were pardoned. Some walked free into the soft air, cold, with no home, no coin, and no welcome. Their names had been spoken in court, their reputations stripped. Freedom for them did not bring peace. Some left the colony entirely, seeking new places where their names were not yet known. Others returned to farms with overgrown fields and empty chairs at their tables, and a few, too many, never made it home at all, their bodies weakened by months of confinement. The ministers of Massachusetts began to preach of reflection. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most respected voices in the colony, spoke against the use of spectral evidence, the very thing that had condemned so many. It were better, he wrote, that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned. It was a quiet rebuke, but it was one the colony could no longer ignore. Some accusers recanted. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the first and most vocal witnesses, stood before her congregation and confessed. She was 26 then, no longer the child who had claimed to see spirits. She spoke with trembling voice, saying, "I desire to be humbled before God for the accusing of several persons, whereby their lives were taken away. It was a great delusion of Satan, and the church listened. Some forgave, some did not, but her words were written down, and still are. The story of the Salem witch trials was not buried. It was carried forward in sermons, in letters, in law. In 1711, the Massachusetts government passed an act that restored the good names of some of the accused. Compensation was offered to families who had lost loved ones, but not every name was included. Not every loss was acknowledged. Even then, some truths proved difficult to admit, and yet the people of Salem and of the wider colony did something remarkable. They remembered, not to celebrate, but to mark, to hold on to the warning, to keep the story honest, to ensure that grief did not vanish with the seasons. Stone by stone, word by word, they told what had happened and what it had cost. Today, we look back at those few months in 1692 with disbelief. How could so many be swept up in such a storm? How could justice bend so far? But perhaps the answer lies not in that year, but in every year before it. The fear had always been there. The pressure, the suspicion, the need for someone to blame. When crops failed, when children fell ill, when misfortune crept into homes without knocking, it only needed a spark. And once lit, it moved too fast to stop. But the embers cooled. Eventually, they always do. And in the ashes, we are left with names. Not just numbers, names. Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Sarah Good, Martha Carrier, Giles Corey, Bridget Bishop. Each one had a face, a voice, a place at the table, a space by the hearth, and each one was taken, but not forgotten. If you walk through Salem today, you'll find the traces, a name on a stone, a replica of the courtroom, the slow sound of your own footsteps down the same paths once walked by frightened hearts. It's quiet now, but in that quiet, the story still breathes. So let your own breath soften. Let the pages turn gently in your mind. The story is not yet finished, but there is no need to rush. Tonight, you've listened. You've wandered gently through time. You've heard voices once buried by snow and silence. And now, it's time to rest. Sleep easy. We will return soon. There's a kind of stillness that settles after sorrow. It's not the silence of forgetting. It's the hush of remembering too much. In the years following the Salem witch trials, Massachusetts did not erase what had happened. It did not try to dress it in glory or soften the edges with pride. Instead, the memory settled into soil, into sermons, into the slow rhythms of daily life. It settled like dust, and dust, as we know, is not absence. It is presence that no longer speaks aloud. By the early 18th century, many of those involved in the trials had passed on. Reverend Samuel Parris, once the village's spiritual leader, died in obscurity. He had moved from parish to parish after resigning from Salem, never fully trusted again. Cotton Mather, one of the most prolific writers and thinkers of the time, whose words had once fueled belief in witchcraft, spent the remainder of his life trying to reconcile his role in what had happened. He continued to write, but the shadow of the trials never fully left his name, and the children who had screamed, who had pointed, who had fallen into fits, they grew older. Some married, some left, and some stayed and grew very quiet. No records tell us much about what they said in their final years. Perhaps they couldn't say anything at all. The people of Salem tried to return to normal life. They planted again. They taught their children. They repaired roofs, rebuilt trust, reopened doors. But now, there was a scar, and like all scars, it reminded them of heat, of pain, of healing, and of what had once been broken. Not all the accused were exonerated quickly. The legal process of clearing names was slow. Families petitioned, waited, wrote letters. Some received acknowledgement within decades. Others had to wait centuries. It wasn't until 2001, over 300 years later, that the last of the accused, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., was formally cleared. 300 years. That's how long it can take for truth to catch up to fear. And so, we remember the names, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary. They were neighbors, midwives, fathers, quiet women who lived on the edge of the village, young girls who dared to disobey, old men who didn't go to church as often as others thought they should. Their ordinariness is what makes their story so important, because if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. And in that truth lies the caution that Salem offers the world. There's a small museum in Salem today where you can read the original documents, the court records, the testimony, the signed confessions. They're written in delicate, spidery script, quill and ink from 3 centuries ago. One document includes the marks of those who could not write their names, a small cross or a shaky X. In another, a list of those who attended an execution, a list that ends with the words, "And they returned home quietly." There's something haunting about that. Not just the event itself, but the quiet afterward, the way the world keeps turning, the way life continues, even after injustice. In modern times, we often look for villains and heroes, clear lines, right and wrong, guilt and innocence. But Salem doesn't offer that so neatly. Instead, it gives us a web, a tangle of belief, fear, ambition, loneliness, superstition, and faith. No one intended to destroy their community, but they did. Not with violence, but with words, with silence, with suspicion left unchecked. And yet, within that story of harm is also a story of repair. Not perfect, not quick, but real. Of people returning to each other, of apologies spoken, of lessons slowly, painfully learned, and of a small village that once allowed fear to rule, trying ever so quietly to make sure it never happened again. This is the part of the story that matters just as much as the trials, the part where people stayed. They stayed and lived with what had happened. They buried their dead. They forgave one another in ways both public and private. They named their daughters after those who had died. They kept the memory alive, not in anger, but in warning. And that's why Salem endures, not just as a place, but as a story. Let that story settle now. You've walked with it long enough for one night. You've seen the frost settle over old stone. You've listened to the slow turning of history. You've stood beneath trees that once witnessed too much. Now you may rest. Sleep gently. More of the story will be here when you wake. By the time spring returned to the fields around Salem, the village was quieter than it had ever been. The thaw came slowly that year. The snow melted in patches, not all at once. Mud filled the furrows in the roads, and the river ran fast with runoff from the hills. Life moved on, because it had to. And yet, something in the air still felt brittle. It was the kind of quiet that didn't ask to be named, the kind that lingered in glances, in pauses, in the way a hand hesitated just before knocking on a neighbor's door. The trees budded again. The barns were repaired. Children returned to their lessons. But everyone, in their own way, was carrying the weight of the year before. Historians later tried to catalog the causes: religious extremism, economic tension, fear of the wilderness, a long winter, the trauma of war, personal vendettas. Each one probably held some truth, but those who lived through it wouldn't have described it with such clean language. They would have spoken of unease, of a feeling they couldn't name, of something shifting just beneath the surface of their lives. And when the accusations started, that hidden fear had finally found a voice. After the trials, the village began to distance itself, not just from the events, but from the name itself. Salem Village, where most of the accusations began, eventually changed its name to Danvers. It was an attempt to draw a line in the soil, to say, that happened, but this is not that place anymore. And Salem Town, now simply Salem, carried the legacy, both the burden and the memory. But of course, names alone cannot change what was witnessed. Stone remembers. So do stories. In time, the witch trials became part of the public consciousness, not just in Massachusetts, but far beyond. In the 19th century, writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose own ancestor had been a judge during the trials, grappled with that history through fiction and poetry. His guilt ran deep. He added a W to his name, changing Hathorne to Hawthorne, to distance himself from the past. Others embraced the story differently. Some dramatized it. Some turned it into theater. Some saw it as a symbol of larger truths: the danger of groupthink, the price of fear, the thin line between righteousness and ruin. And still, others quietly tended to the graves. They walked the old paths. They knelt by the memorial stones. They didn't speak of witches. They spoke of people: Rebecca, Giles, Bridget, Susanna. Names, not archetypes, not cautionary figures. People. The trials have since become something studied, analyzed, debated, used as metaphor, but at their heart, they are a human story, a story of how fear spreads, of how belief can become brittle, of how the machinery of justice, when rushed or tilted, can destroy what it was meant to protect, and also of how people try to live again, even when the weight of the past clings like smoke in their clothes. There's a lesson in how long it took for the last exonerations to happen, a reminder that even in the most forward-thinking societies, acknowledging wrongdoing can take longer than committing it. Some families received apologies, some never did. Some names were cleared by act of law, some only by public memory. But still, the remembering continues. There are lantern walks in Salem now, at night, softly lit tours that guide people through the old streets. Not for fear, not for thrill, but for history. Stories told in low voices, footsteps echoing against stone. A reminder that memory is not just what we carry, it's what we choose to keep alive. So tonight, you've walked further into this story. Not the loud parts, not the fire or the rope or the courtrooms, but the quiet parts. The rooms left empty, the places that no longer exist, but still hold a shape in the mind. The echo of voices asking how a town could turn so quickly. You've listened, and that listening, that gentle act of presence, is how stories like these stay whole. Rest now. We will return to Salem again soon, to the people who stayed, to the ones who built after, to the world that slowly made peace with its ghosts. But for now, let the world grow soft. Let your thoughts drift like snow falling on old rooftops, and let this chapter close with silence. Morning light in colonial New England came gently through glass too warped to be clear. Sunlight did not flood in. It crept, soft and golden, filtered through linen curtains, dancing across wooden floorboards and the creaks of time-worn houses. Salem, in the early 1700s, had returned to a kind of rhythm, the rhythm of sowing and reaping, of prayer and supper, of bells marking time between birth and death. But beneath that rhythm was a slower current, a quiet remembrance. The events of 1692 did not vanish. They settled in the soil, in the sermons, in the way people avoided certain names, certain roads, certain shadows. And yet, life continued because it must. The village that had once cried out in fear had no choice now but to listen to its own silence. Cows still needed milking, fields still needed tending, children still grew. But there was a gentleness in Salem now that had not existed before. Not always kindness, but caution, measured speech, careful thought, the kind of quiet that comes after learning what words can do when let loose without mercy. In the homes of the accused, some families had begun to rebuild. Timber was patched, chairs carved anew. But grief did not soften so quickly. There were those who had lost spouses, those who had lost parents, and those who had returned from jail to find their farms overgrown and their names whispered with pity. Not all were welcomed back. Forgiveness is not always swift, even when the crime never existed. One man, Jonathan Alden, kept a journal during those years. He hadn't been accused, hadn't spoken in court, but he had watched, and he had written. His entries were plain, sparse, almost weather-like. April 1692, a dog was shot today, accused of specters. The children watched. June 1692, Bridget Bishop, gone. Rain fell all day. It soaked the rope. October 1693, no more trials. But the town does not laugh like it used to. His writing was not poetry, but it was truth. And long after his death, his journal was found in a drawer, wrapped in wax cloth, a relic of what it was like to watch a world lose its footing. By the mid-1700s, the story of Salem was no longer whispered. It was written. Ministers and scholars began to examine it, not just as a failure of law, but as a moment of cultural collapse. They debated, why had the girls screamed? Why had the judges believed? Why had the ministers stood by? But the answers rarely satisfied, because what happened in Salem was not a single event. It was a pattern, stitched into place over decades. Fear of the unknown, strict religious codes, isolation, and the pressure, always, to explain misfortune with blame. Still, not all the lessons were ignored. Laws were slowly changed. Spectral evidence was no longer considered reliable. Confessions under duress began to raise suspicion rather than certainty, and the idea of a presumption of innocence, radical for its time, took firmer root. In this way, the people of Massachusetts began to reshape the soil from which such panic had grown, not perfectly, not instantly, but meaningfully. Today, Salem bears the image of what happened, but not always its weight. There are shops and museums, costumed guides, and ghost tours, postcards that feature broomsticks and black cats. To some, it is a spectacle. To others, a wound. And between those two extremes lies something quieter, the real memory, the grave markers, the transcripts, the handwritten pleas for mercy, the faces in faded sketches, the sound of silence in a courtroom that no longer stands. If you visit the memorial today, you'll see the benches carved with names, one for each person executed. There are no dates, no ages, no crimes, only names, because that is what was taken first. Their name, their place, their voice, and that is what the memorial gives back. A seat, a presence, a place to be remembered, not for the way they died, but for the fact that they lived. In the end, the Salem witch trials are not just a story of fear. They are a story of how deeply people crave explanation, of how fragile trust can be, of how easily justice can be bent when clouded by urgency, of how belief, when untempered by reason, can become a storm. But they are also a story of remembrance, of voices reclaimed, of apologies, however late, of a village that did not bury its shame, but carried it forward so others would know. Let your thoughts settle now. The town of Salem rests in shadow again. The stones have cooled, the grass has grown, and the names have found their places. You have walked with them, listened, learned, and now you may rest. The past is quiet, the wind softens, the story breathes slowly. Sleep, and when you wake, the path will be waiting. Night in colonial New England brought a different kind of quiet, without lamps on every street or the hum of distant traffic. Darkness felt like a living thing. It wrapped around homes and pressed gently at the windows. Inside, families gathered close, by hearths, by candlelight, by habit. In Salem, long after the trials, this nighttime quiet returned. But it was not quite the same. It was deeper now, not out of peace, but out of memory, because even as the years passed, the village did not forget, could not forget, and in that remembering, the nights held a different weight. The woods beyond the village, once feared for their wilderness, were now feared for their silence. It was not the devil people spoke of anymore, but their own choices, their own doubts, the way they had once followed certainty into cruelty, the way suspicion had grown so fast it choked reason before anyone had noticed. It was not ghosts they feared now, it was memory. One old woman, Ruth Putnam, lived to be nearly 80. She had been only a child in 1692, too young to speak in court, too old not to remember. In her final years, she kept a small diary. It was never meant to be read. It lived in a drawer with dried herbs and yellowed letters. But long after she died, her granddaughter found the book. In it, Ruth wrote, "We do not say their names enough. We call them those who were hanged, as if the rope was the beginning. It was not. The beginning was in our silence, and so I will say their names here, even if no one hears." And she did, one per page, with small notes beside some. She lived near the river. He made fine wooden bowls. She sang on washing days. These were not confessions. They were restorations. Not everyone forgot, and not everyone stayed silent. Over time, stories continued to surface, small ones. A man who gave food to the jailed. A woman who refused to testify, even under threat. A child who snuck a blanket to the steps of the meeting house during a hearing. These quiet kindnesses didn't undo the fear, but they lived alongside it, proof that even in moments of panic, some hearts stayed steady. And then there were those who had simply watched, people who did not speak, but who bore witness. They carried the memory forward, not in books or speeches, but in how they raised their children, in how they taught about fairness, in how they told stories around the fire that didn't end with heroes, but with questions. What would you have done? What should we do when others are afraid? What matters more, truth or peace? These questions shaped generations, and perhaps they still do. Salem, like any place with a story, has layers. There is the tourist Salem, the Salem of costumes and cauldrons, of souvenir shops and candlelit tours. Then there is the historic Salem, the records, the names, the stones. But underneath both is something quieter, the Salem that lives in reflection, in every town where gossip travels fast, in every moment where fear overrules kindness, in every courtroom where doubt is called guilt. Salem lives there too, not as a ghost, but as a mirror. Even now, people travel to Salem not to learn about witches, but to understand how a community can lose itself, how it can find itself again, and how long that journey can take. In the late 20th century, a small group of citizens pushed for something more permanent than plaques or apologies. They envisioned a space where visitors could pause, not just to learn, but to feel, not just to see the past, but to be still inside it. The Salem witch trials memorial was born from that vision, designed with care, spare, unadorned, silent, just 20 granite benches, one for each life lost, each bearing a name and words spoken before death, not dramatic words, just human ones. I am no witch. I am wronged. God knows my innocence. Words that reached across time, not for justice, but for dignity. People sit there still. Some leave flowers. Some say nothing. But all feel the hush. Because the story does not need retelling in loud voices. It has already spoken enough. Now, as night returns again in this story, let your breath grow softer. You've walked among those names, listened to a village remember, felt the weight not just of what happened, but how it lingers. Let that weight fall now. Let the quiet return. Let your body soften, your mind slow, and rest, knowing that the story will wait until you're ready to return. By the early 1800s, more than a century had passed since the last hanging on Gallows Hill. Generations had come and gone. Children had grown, married, built homes, planted trees. Time had carried the village forward, smoothing the edges of even its sharpest memories. But Salem still carried the imprint of 1692, not on the surface, but underneath, in the folds of maps, in the cracks between buildings, in the silences between stories told too carefully. The witch trials were not a wound that bled openly. They were a scar, quiet, permanent, always just under the skin. During this time, America itself was changing. The revolution had come and gone. The colonies were now a country. Cities expanded. Ideas spread more quickly through newspapers, books, public lectures, and with that, growth came curiosity. People began to ask again, what had happened in Salem? Why had neighbors accused each other? Why had ministers allowed it? How had a quiet village turned on itself so quickly? Writers and thinkers revisited the trials, not to relive the horror, but to understand the people. And in that process, the world began to see the Salem witch trials not just as a cautionary tale, but as a deeply human one. It was during this century that Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author of The Scarlet Letter, wrote from Salem. His ancestor, Judge John Hathorne, had presided over the trials without apology. Nathaniel carried that legacy heavily. He added a W to his surname, Hawthorne, a soft addition perhaps, but a quiet disavowal. He could not change the past, but he could change his name. In his stories, Hawthorne often returned to themes of guilt, shame, hidden sin, and the moral weight of judgment. He never wrote a book solely about the trials, but their influence threaded through his pages like a shadow at the edge of candlelight. And through him, Salem's story lived again, not in screams or gallows, but in whispers, in guilt passed from father to son, in the weight of belief, in the cost of silence. In the quiet corners of Salem, the memorialization continued. More letters were discovered, more diaries surfaced, church records were reviewed. Each new finding added a voice, a thought, a hesitation, a plea, and slowly the Aesop story grew fuller, less about witches, more about fear, less about evil, more about the absence of kindness when it was most needed. The 19th century also saw the beginning of historic tourism. People began visiting Salem not for trade, but for memory. They walked its streets. They stood where the meeting house once stood. They asked where the hangings had taken place. They read the court records, and they wondered, what would I have done? It's a question Salem still asks of everyone who visits. Throughout this period, descendants of the accused began to speak more openly. Some petitioned for formal exoneration. Others held gatherings to read aloud the words of those lost. And a few quietly tended family plots, keeping the graves of long-forgotten names from slipping beneath the grass. These acts were not grand, but they mattered, because memory, when tended with care, becomes something more than history. It becomes truth, restored. Let us return now to the landscape itself. The forests around Salem were not cleared. They remained, tall and still. The stone walls stayed, too, moss-covered and leaning. The same cold wind swept across the same hilltops, and the ocean beyond Salem Harbor whispered the same tide songs. In these constants, the story found grounding, not in spectacle, but in setting, because it is often the quiet places that remember best. And within that setting, the voices of 1692 never truly vanished. They settled into ink and paper, into the breath of stories told around firelight, into the old names etched on documents and stones. And they waited, not to be judged, but to be understood. As you rest now in the warmth of this story, feel the gentle rhythm of its pace. There is no need to hurry. The village sleeps. The trees are still. The path forward is soft beneath your feet. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let this part of the story close with a sense of quiet. We will return. There is more to learn, more to feel. But for now, let the names rest. Let the wind pass, and let sleep take hold. By the 20th century, Salem had become a place of dual identity. On one side, it was a modern American town. Shops and schools, stoplights and sidewalks, the ordinary rhythm of contemporary life. On the other, it remained the keeper of a very old story, a story that had stretched across centuries, a story of panic and repentance, belief and loss, a story not preserved in glass cases, but etched into the daily movement of the town itself. Salem was no longer the village of 1692, but it had never quite stopped being it either, because stories, once rooted deeply, don't leave, they grow. The early 1900s saw a shift. Historians began to look more closely, not just at what happened in Salem, but why it had happened. They explored the theological strictness of Puritan life, the pressure of the frontier, the isolation, the presence of indigenous conflict at the edge of the colony, the simmering tensions between old wealth and new poverty, between town and village. No single cause emerged, but a pattern became clear. Salem was not merely a town with witches, it was a town with wounds, and the trials had not begun because of spells or curses. They had begun because of fear, the kind of fear that grows slowly, that is passed down, that is whispered instead of spoken, the kind that finds its voice only when it's too late. In the midst of this re-examination, Salem also began to draw visitors. People came not just for research, but for meaning. Some were curious, some were reverent, some sought connection to ancestors, and others simply came to walk, to stand on cobblestone streets, to pass beneath the branches of trees that had seen it all, to read names on granite stones beneath soft morning rain. For many, Salem became a place of reflection, a place where history breathed, not loudly, but steadily. In 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the trials, the Salem Witch Trials Memorial was officially dedicated. It had taken years of effort, planning, and quiet advocacy. 20 granite benches, each bearing a name, a few short words, a moment frozen in time, and around those benches, a low stone wall, not to enclose, but to remember. The names were not carved in guilt or in mourning. They were carved in dignity, each one a person, each one restored. Visitors sit in silence at the memorial. They read the names. They trace the carved words with their fingers. They leave flowers, stones, letters. Some cry, others bow their heads, and many simply sit, letting the quiet do what words cannot. In classrooms across the country, children still learn about the Salem witch trials. They read the names. They study the court records. They ask questions. Why did it happen? Why didn't someone stop it? What did they mean by spectral evidence? And perhaps the most important question, could it happen again? These lessons are not just about the past. They are warnings, reminders, whispers from a time when fear outweighed fairness, so that we might keep the balance ourselves. It's easy to imagine that stories like Salem's are only about the past, but if you listen closely, not just with your ears, but with your stillness, you'll find that the story still speaks in every rushed judgment, in every unfounded fear, in every moment where belief turns sharp and understanding fades. Salem tells us, be slow to condemn, be slower still to forget. As night settles again over this story, the streets grow quiet once more. Gas lamps flicker, leaves move across slate paths. A clock tolls the hour from a church whose bell has outlived 3 centuries, and beneath it all the voices sleep, not forgotten, held. Let yourself sleep now too. Let the story fade to a low hum. Let your breath fall in rhythm with the slow beat of history. You have walked gently, listened kindly, and carried the story well. Rest, knowing it is safe in you. There is more to share, but not tonight. Tonight, there is only the hush of trees, the stone underfoot, and the warmth of stillness. There are stories that shout, and there are stories that whisper. The Salem witch trials, though once filled with the noise of accusations, gavel strikes, and cries from the gallows, has become a story of whispers. The louder it once was, the softer it now rests, and in that softness it teaches, not with spectacle, not with horror, but with the quiet weight of memory. By the turn of the 21st century, Salem had become a city shaped as much by the future as the past. The town embraced its identity fully and with complexity. There were candle shops and bookstores, tarot readers and reenactments, museums that showed court documents under glass, and gift shops that sold broomstick pins. But behind the display, behind the commerce, the real story lived on, not for sale, but for those who slowed down long enough to feel it, for those who turned left instead of right, who walked away from the crowds, who found themselves on a narrow lane where the air still carried the quiet of 1692. It is here that you might find a small plaque, half hidden in ivy, that marks the site of an old meeting house. Not much remains. The building is long gone, but the ground remembers. The wind moves differently there. The branches hush, and if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. A chair scraping back, a heartbeat rising, a silence stretching too long. The place where neighbors once looked across the aisle and saw not community, but suspicion. It is just a patch of earth now, but it holds everything. For some, Salem is now a place of pilgrimage, not for magic, but for memory. Descendants of the accused leave flowers. Writers sit on stone benches and listen. Visitors take photographs, not for spectacle, but for proof that something happened here, something fragile, something frightening, something that must not be forgotten. The lessons of Salem are not etched only in books. They are in the space between judgment and mercy, between fear and understanding, between silence and courage. And this is why we return to it, to understand not just the people of 1692, but ourselves. A historian once wrote that the Salem witch trials are not about witches at all. They are about the community that imagined them, about what happens when belief outruns reason, when fear is given shape and called truth, when doubt is punished and silence becomes survival, and when, finally, regret arrives too late, but still matters. Even now, people write poems about Salem. They paint it, they walk it, they dream of it, not because they want to relive the tragedy, but because they want to carry its lesson gently forward. Some say history is written by the victors, but the history of Salem was written by the remembrance, by the families who refused to let the names disappear, by the teachers who told the truth, by the city that, over centuries, transformed from shame to stewardship. It did not forget, and so the story endured. Let that be the final lesson tonight, that remembering, when done with care, is an act of love, not of clinging to sorrow, but of honoring it, not of reliving grief, but of softening the ground so it does not grow again. Now, as this part of the story closes, return to stillness. Feel the ground beneath you, the same ground that has held so many steps. Let the names you've heard settle gently in your thoughts, not as burdens, but as lanterns, carried forward, softly, one step at a time. Good night, listener. You've walked far. You've listened well. Let sleep come now, with the hush of pine trees and the softness of old stories. Let the wind be still. Let the stones rest. Let you, too, rest. As the centuries stretched forward from that short, violent year of 1692, Salem became something few could have predicted. A symbol, not just a place on a map, but a reference point, a name used in courtrooms, classrooms, conversations, a modern-day witch hunt, they say now. When someone is judged too quickly or blamed without cause, it is a phrase used often, sometimes carelessly, sometimes wisely, but always it draws its meaning from the same place, from Salem, from the quiet streets, from the panic that once spilled through them like smoke through a chimney. And yet, the city itself, this living place, is more than a warning. It's a landscape where remembrance and routine walk hand in hand, where a family shops for groceries next door to a building that once held trials, where school children play in a park that overlooks the hill where the gallows once stood, where the scent of salt air from the harbor carries the same chill felt by those who stood accused, but also where people plant flowers, hang lanterns, and whisper stories into the wind, not to fear them, but to keep them alive. The truth is, Salem has always been a place of contradiction. It is a place where cruelty once wore the mask of righteousness, and now where tourism wears the costume of justice. But look beneath that surface. Look just beneath, and you'll find something softer, You'll find a bench near Charter Street, stone cold and quiet, never crowded. From it, you can see the trees, the sky, and the faint curve of the old cemetery wall. It's not marked with plaques. It doesn't explain itself. But if you sit there long enough, you'll notice something. That here, the wind sounds like pages turning. That here, birdsong drifts like breath between branches. That here, time folds gently. And that just across the way, one of the gravestones belongs to a man who signed a petition in 1692, a simple man who said, "These women are known to us. They are not witches. They are good wives." He spoke quietly. His petition was ignored, but now, 300 years later, people still come to read his name. And so, his voice lives on. These are the echoes Salem offers. Not thunder, not trumpet, but the hush of footsteps, the creak of floorboards, the breath of forgiveness, whispered under stars. Each October, the city fills again. Decorations, lights, costumes, laughter, and for some this feels strange, frivolous even, to dance where others once wept, to celebrate a word which that was once a death sentence, but others see something else, a reclaiming, a defiance, a way of saying fear no longer lives here, that joy can grow where judgment once ruled, that community can thrive where suspicion once dug its roots deep, and that perhaps the most powerful remembrance is not sorrow, but renewal. Still, the real Salem, the quiet Salem, waits until the crowd has passed, at dusk, in early spring, when the air is cool and the skies are gray-blue and the city seems to remember itself. That is when you hear it again. Not voices, not cries, but breath, the breath of history, steady, patient, always present, always waiting. Let us return to that breath now. Let your own breathing slow. Let the noise fade. Let the light dim, just enough to soften the shape of things. You've followed this path with grace. You've walked past the gallows and into gardens, past fear and into reflection, past blame and into care. And now, as night returns to our story, you are invited not to judge it, but to hold it just as it is, just as it was, and just as it will always be, a story worth remembering. Close your eyes now, if they haven't already drifted shut. Feel the hush. Feel the steady warmth of your body resting. You are safe. You are quiet. And you are not alone. The story sleeps beside you and will be here when you wake, in the early hours of morning, before the markets open and before the streets fill with the footfall of another day. Salem breathes in its quietest form. The mist hangs low, weaving between rooftops and tombstones. The ocean beyond the harbor murmurs against stone walls, and the trees, those ever-listening trees, stand watch in stillness. This is the Salem that few see, the Salem that holds memory, not in displays or plaques, but in air and earth. The Salem that listens before it speaks. And in this quiet, the story of the witch trials breathes once more, not as condemnation, not as spectacle, but as a whisper of warning, of remembrance, and of care. The more we look back on the Salem witch trials, the more we see they were never really about witches. There were no broomsticks, no spells, no cauldrons bubbling in the dark. What there was fear and grief and pressure and silence and the terrible weight of needing someone to blame when the world no longer made sense. By now, historians have pored over every detail: the sermons, the confessions, the patterns of accusation, the language of the courtroom, the roots of old grudges. And yet, still, what lingers is not just the facts, it's the feeling of a town that broke its own heart and then lived with that ache for centuries. We know their names now: Bridget, Sarah, Martha, Giles, Rebecca, John. But once, these names were marks on a list, charges, numbers. It took generations to return their names to what they were: people. People who baked bread, who sang while gathering herbs, who prayed, who made mistakes, who loved and lost and laughed and wept. And in remembering them fully, we return to ourselves. Because we are not so different, we fear, we judge, we fall silent, and we, sometimes, find the courage to speak again. There is a particular grave in Salem, not of one who died in the trials, but of someone who tried, quietly, to stop them. A neighbor, a friend, a name not often remembered, but beside the stone, someone always leaves a small note, folded, anonymous. Every year the note is different, but it always begins the same way: I will not be silent. That is what Salem gives us now. Not closure, but choice. The choice to remember, the choice to learn, the choice to speak gently, especially when it's easier to stay quiet. As you lie here, listening with your breath, know that your presence in this story matters. To remember is an act of care. To listen deeply and without interruption is its own kind of justice. You've walked through fog and fire, through courtrooms and corners. You've stood by graves and sat beside stone benches. You've heard voices, not crying out, but waiting to be named, to be seen, to be more than a paragraph in a book. And you've answered simply by being here. Rest now. Let the story settle in your chest like warmth. Let it hold you gently. You are safe, you are steady, and you are part of the remembering. The wind carries the names. The stones hold the silence. The village waits, not for judgment, but for kindness. Good night, dear listener. We will return. The Salem of today is stitched together from many Salems. The colonial village with dirt paths and flickering lanterns still exists, in memory, in reconstructions, in the lines of old maps. So too does the Salem of fear and trial, carried in court transcripts and confessions written under the glow of candlelight. And then there is the Salem that lives now, walkable, modern, layered with museums and town halls, street vendors, and school children, all moving gently through a place that remembers what it once was. History does not disappear, it nests, and in Salem, those layers remain visible. If you move slowly enough to see them, there is a corner near the harbor where an old iron fence leans slightly, and behind it, a crooked tree stretches its arms wide above the sidewalk. The bark is scarred, the roots pushing up through bricks laid long after the tree first took root. There's no sign beside it, no plaque, no story told aloud, but it is said that people used to gather there, to wait, to whisper, to look for signs in the sky, in their neighbors, in each other, not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid, afraid of misfortune, of hunger, of things they couldn't name. And when that fear needed somewhere to go, it found the faces of other people, the unusual, the outspoken, the lonely, and it labeled them. Fear, unspoken, can grow like that tree, twisting, bending, pushing up through whatever tries to bury it. But so too can truth, and so can care. In the quiet of the Salem nighttime, that care still hums softly in the stones. It lives in how the city has chosen to remember, not with glory, but with reverence, not with denial, but with dignity. Memorials that ask nothing but pause. Stones carved not with judgment, but with final words. Gardens planted not just for beauty, but for stillness. Each year, the city reads the names aloud. All 20 who were executed, and those who died in prison, and even those who were accused, but lived. It takes time. The list is long, but no one rushes, because to speak the names slowly is to honor them rightly, and to say their names is to return what history briefly took away, their voice. And what of us, the listeners, the readers, the ones who inherit the story with fresh eyes and quiet hearts? We are part of Salem too, because each time we sit with the story, without looking away, without simplifying, without turning it into entertainment, we become caretakers of its truth. We help it breathe. We help it soften. We help it settle, not as a wound, but as a lesson that never forgets its root. It's easy to look back with distance and say, I would not have believed, I would not have accused. But Salem asks something gentler, not for certainty, but for humility, for the awareness that fear is quiet until it's not. That kindness must be practiced. That silence, when it protects the wrong thing, becomes a weight we all carry, and most of all, that it is never too late to speak carefully. Tonight, as you lie still in your own space, far from wooden courtrooms and windswept hills, know that you are sharing in something rare, a remembering without noise, a mourning without spectacle, a walk through time that does not ask you to judge, only to stay, to be present, to hold the story, not like a stone, but like a candle, softly, gently, with care. Let the path dim now. Let your eyes rest. Let your breath deepen. The voices are quiet now. The trees still sway. The stones rest cool in the earth. And the names, once forgotten, now glow softly behind your eyelids. You have done well to carry them, and they are safe here with you. Even the softest stories need an ending, not one that closes the door, but one that lays the story down gently, like placing a folded quilt at the end of a bed. And as the Salem witch trials reach their final chapters, what remains is not the fire or the gallows, but the memory of how people carried on afterward. Because they did. They carried their grief in quiet ways. They planted new gardens. They stitched names into family Bibles. They stopped to listen when others spoke because they had learned, too late, what silence could cost. And in doing so, they began the slow work of healing. In the years after the last trial, Salem changed in small but certain ways. The laws shifted, the churches softened, the community grew less rigid, though never perfect. And while no single moment marked the village's return to peace, people began to live without the daily ache of fear. Children once too small to understand became the new keepers of the story. They asked their mothers and grandfathers why so many had died. They pointed to empty chairs. They tugged sleeves and whispered names, waiting for someone to say, "Finally, we remember." And so, memory, as it always does, threaded itself quietly through the generations. It found its way into letters stored in attics, into stones half buried behind churches, into lullabies sung to children whose ancestors once stood in court. History is not always loud. Sometimes it lingers in what people choose to repeat, and sometimes in what they vow never to repeat again. A minister, many years after the trials, wrote a sermon titled, "Justice Delayed is Justice Remembered." He never mentioned Salem directly. He didn't need to. Everyone knew what he meant. That truth, when it comes too late, does not lose its power, but gains a different kind, a gentler kind, a kind that asks not for revenge, but for reflection. In the present day, you can still hear that reflection in Salem, not just in museums, not only during tours, but in the way people speak the names, in the way hands touch cold stone, in the quiet that settles over the memorial like a blanket after snowfall. Sometimes visitors leave folded paper cranes on the benches. Sometimes a note tucked under a rock reads only, "I see you now." And in those small offerings, the story finds peace. Not all stories need to be solved. Some only ask to be held, like a thread between generations, like a candle passed from hand to hand. And Salem's story, at its core, is a story of what happens when fear replaces listening. But it is also a story of what happens after, when the voices fall silent, when the trials are over, when the ground is still again, and someone slowly says, "Let us begin again." Tonight, you are part of that beginning by listening, by breathing, by being still with the memory. You have carried the names gently. You have walked beside grief without turning away. You have held space for a past that asks only to be remembered, not rewritten. That is the great kindness of this journey. That presence, not perfection, is what keeps the story whole. So let the story rest now. Let the winds soften. Let the pages close one by one. You are safe here. The past is quiet, and the voices you've met are no longer alone. Breathe gently, feel the stillness settle, and know that when you wake, the world will hold this memory with you, tenderly, always. This is where the story ends, not with a verdict, not with the clang of a gavel or the fading of torches, but with quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives when a story has been carried well, when the voices have been heard, when the names have been spoken, when the earth has been walked slowly enough to remember what it holds. In Salem now, there are more flowers than stones, more footsteps of school children than judges, more curiosity than fear. The gallows are gone, the court dissolved, the records preserved, but never worshipped. What remains is the echo of what was lost, of what was learned, and of what we choose to keep alive. Every October, light flickers in 'em, the windows of old houses. Jack-o'-lanterns smile on porches. Costumed laughter spills from corners. Some call it commercial, some call it healing, but beneath it there is a deeper rhythm in candle-lit vigils, in the gathering of descendants, in the soft repetition of names that once lived and were once lost. This isn't just a city of ghosts. It is a city of memory, and memory, when honored gently, becomes a blessing. Tonight, you've honored that memory. You've walked alongside it, listened to it, carried it without flinching, not for drama, not for entertainment, but for truth, and for the quiet beauty of presence. If you were to walk Salem's streets tomorrow, no one would know you'd heard this story, but you would carry it in how you listen, in how you speak, in how you pause before judgment, and remember how fragile people can be. That is the lesson Salem offers, not one of magic or monsters, but of mercy, of how precious it is to be believed, to be seen fully, to be heard without fear, and how dangerous it is to take that away from another. The witch trials may be over, but the care they call for never ends. It is ongoing, like breath, like stories, like love. So let us rest here at the edge of the story. The night is full, the path is soft, the trees still stand, and the stones no longer weep. You have walked well, you have listened long, now you may sleep. Let the names be light behind your eyes. Let your thoughts drift like ash through cold air. Let the hush of history wrap around you, quiet and complete. The voices are still now. The village sleeps. The story rests. And so may you. Good night. You are safe. You are held. You are home.